Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. Jeanne Mance was a French nurse and settler of New France who arrived 2 years after the Ursuline nuns came to Quebec. Among the founders of Montreal in 1642, she established its first hospital, the Hôtel-Dieu de Montréal, in 1645. Jeanne Mance was born into a bourgeois family in a Burgundy town 180 miles southeast of Paris. After her mother died, Jeanne cared for 11 brothers and sisters. She went on to care for victims of the 30 Years' War and the plague. At age 34, she was not interested in marriage, and while on a pilgrimage, Jeanne discovered her missionary calling. She decided to go to New France in North America, then in the first stages of colonization by the French. She was supported by the wife of King Louis XIII and by the Jesuits. Jeanne's goal was to found a hospital in Montreal similar to the one in Quebec. She embarked from La Rochelle in May 1641 on a crossing of the Atlantic that took 3 months. After wintering in Quebec, she and Paul Chomedey de Maisonneuve arrived at the island of Montreal in the spring of 1642. They founded the new city on land granted by the governor. That same year, Jeanne began operating a hospital in her home. 3 years later, she opened a hospital on St. Paul Street. She directed its operations for 17 years. She returned to France to seek financial support for the hospital. On her return to Montreal, she found that the attacks of the Iroquois threatened the colony and loaned the hospital money to Maisonneuve, who returned to France to organize a force of 100 men for the colony's defense. After providing most of the care directly for years, in 1657 she recruited 3 religious sisters and continued to direct operations of the hospital. For the rest of her years, she lived more quietly. She died in 1673 and was buried in the church of the Hôtel-Dieu Hospital. A new stone structure was built in 1688, and others have been built since then. While the hospital church and her house were demolished in 1696 for redevelopment, her work was carried on by a religious group with the 3 nuns whom she had recruited serving as hospital administrators. 2 centuries later, in 1861, the hospital was moved to the foot of Mount Royal. Many Montreal landmarks are named for Jeanne Mance to this day. Paul Chomedey de Maisonneuve was a French military officer and the founder of Ville-Marie, now the city of Montreal. He was recruited to head up a mission on Montreal Island in New France. Maisonneuve was hired to lead the colonists and ensure their safety in the new land. In Quebec City, the Jesuits and the governor tried to dissuade them from their undertaking on account of the war with the Iroquois. They felt this plan could not hold out against their raids. Throughout the 17th century, the Iroquois were a military power to be reckoned with. Battles in 1626 brought them victory over the Mohican and gave them control over the Hudson Valley. They invaded the territory of the Huron in the 1640s, then intensified their campaign against the settlers of New France, including Montreal. The Jesuits described the Iroquois fearfully, as follows: "They come like foxes in the woods. They attack like lions. They flee like birds. They could pass before our settlement in broad daylight and nobody would be able to pursue them or recover the captives they had seized." The Iroquois were masters at guerrilla warfare, striking with quick, devastating raids that kept their casualties to a minimum. The 12,000 members of the 5 nations, this number grew considerably through the practice of adopting prisoners, could summon 2,200 disciplined warriors. The little French colony on the St. Lawrence River had only 350 inhabitants. This tiny foothold was left to defend itself when the French crown refused to help. Beginning in 1643, the Iroquois attacked the outposts of Montreal, disrupting trading and agriculture. The Iroquois have shut down the entire trade in beavers, which has always been one of the great resources of the country, one Jesuit wrote. The Iroquois effectively seized control of the fur trade, blocking French access to the interior and preventing other native nations from trading with New France. From 1645, the colony was in a state of siege. Settlers no longer cleared the land. In 1643, 3 colonists were killed at the very foot of the palisade of Montreal. The next year, de Maisonneuve, founder and governor of the city, barely escaped death during an abortive sortie against 200 enemy warriors surrounding his fort. Throughout the following night, he could hear the screams of his comrades being tortured. This bad news stemmed the already waning tide of immigration to the fledgling colony and settlement in Montreal. Ville-Marie was born of a dream to bring pious natives and Frenchmen together to create a new people of God. In 1643, a flood threatened the city. Maisonneuve prayed to the Virgin Mary to stop the inundation, and when it abated, he erected a cross atop Mount Royal. A cross has been maintained there to the current day. Of the local First Nations tribes with whom these French settlers had contact with, the Mohawk, who were already trading with the Dutch and in New Amsterdam, now modern New York City, resented French efforts to interrupt the trade. The Mohawk were based in present-day New York State, south of Montreal, and severely threatened the new colony. The Algonquin, in contrast, maintained peaceful relations with the newly arrived Europeans. Nevertheless, they were often at war with the Haudenosaunee, better known as the Iroquois, who discovered the existence of the new French settlement of Montreal, whose defense Maisonneuve commanded using his military training. Already familiar with the terrain, the Haudenosaunee would often observe and engage the French settlers from the safety of the woods. That devastating strategy was the beginning of a long conflict between the groups as they were competing with each other for game and other resources. On March 30th, 1644, the situation came to a head. Warned by their guard dogs as to the nearby presence of their enemies, a band of 30 settlers went into the forest to face their foes. Once in the woods, the French encountered 250 Haudenosaunee people in ambush, waiting for them. Retreating in the face of such uneven odds, Maisonneuve remained last so that the others could make it safely back to the fort, resulting in him being set upon by an Iroquois chief. In this decisive moment, Maisonneuve fired twice on the chief, thus killing him before returning to the safety of the fort amid much fanfare. In 1645, Maisonneuve received news that his father had died, and he returned to France. There, he was offered the position of governor of New France but turned it down, wanting to continue his leadership of Ville-Marie. Maisonneuve returned to Montreal in 1647, and the wars with the Iroquois continued. In the spring of 1651, the Iroquois attacks became so frequent and so violent that Ville-Marie thought that its end had come. Maisonneuve made all the settlers take refuge in the fort. By 1652, the colony at Montreal had been so reduced that he was forced to return to France to raise 100 volunteers to go with him to the colony the following year. If the effort had failed, Montreal would have been abandoned and the survivors relocated downriver to Quebec City. When the 100 arrived in the fall of 1653, the population of Montreal was barely 50 people. Over time, the colony grew in size and eventually was large enough to be secure from the Iroquois threat. Ownership of the colony was transferred from the Missionary Society to the Sulpicians as New France had been proclaimed a royal province in 1663. Governance of Montreal was assumed by the Governor-General and the Sovereign Council. In 1665, the Lieutenant General of New France ordered Maisonneuve to return to France on indefinite leave. After 24 years as head of the colony, he left Montreal for good. Maisonneuve died in Paris in 1676. He is remembered and honored to this day as the principal founder of Montreal, alongside Jeanne Mance. I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.